We're often told that yoga is a 5,000-year-old tradition, but is it really? And which parts of it are 5,000 years old? We like to think that our asana, or our postures, are an ancient spiritual practice, but they're actually not. Let's explore the real history of yoga asana together right now. Welcome to the Modern Mystics Podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kaivalya, the yoga doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices, both ancient and modern. Get ready to up-level your status as a modern mystic. So, I think that I felt lied to when I first found out that yoga asana was actually a very recent creation in yoga's history. I had been doing yoga asana for probably a decade at the point that I realized this, and it felt like I had been duped. I had always been told that yoga was a 5,000-year-old tradition, and I guess I had just assumed that that meant all of yoga's practices. But in fact, it doesn't. I happen to be leading a teacher training program in Bali, Indonesia, when one of my colleagues started talking to me about the true history of asana. I think he said something quippy like, "Oh, we're all just making this shit up." And I laughed and I said, "What are you talking about? Ancient sages and princes used to do sun salutations." And he said, "No, my friend, do your research." So I did, and I'll actually point you to a couple of different places where I found some great research. The first really is called Yoga Body. It's a book by Mark Singleton, and this is where the news really broke to the world that asana isn't as old as we may have once thought. That's a powerful book, and I would highly suggest it. It's going to outline and go more deeply into some of the things I'll talk about here with you today. But let's start with the ancient practices of yoga. Yes, yoga is 5,000 years old, but it didn't look like what we do now 5,000 years ago. So 5,000 years ago, it wasn't necessarily called yoga. These were just the ancient spiritual practices of the Vedic tradition, the tradition in the Indus Valley, which today we call India. And it wasn't necessarily a ritualized practice amongst groups as we do it today. It would have been mainly for the priestly elevated caste or class in that time, in that place. And the things that they were doing 5,000 years ago were chanting, meditation, and ritual. Those are the elements of yoga practice that are actually probably 5,000 or so years old. We do have chants in the Vedas. We do have rituals outlined in the Vedas. We do have evidence of meditation practice being done and talked about in the Vedas. So that is where the roots of our yogic tradition comes from. Now, it wasn't necessarily called yoga for another couple of thousand years, but the same roots apply. We really see yoga coming into its own and being called yoga around 2,500 years ago with texts like the Upanishads, which are a collection of spiritual texts, which essentially were distillations of the vast text of the Vedas. So the Vedas contain 5 books. They're huge, enormous. It would be impossible to read them all probably in one's lifetime. And so to try to weed through all of that, which included all sorts of information like when you should get your hair cut, when you should plant the seeds and reap your harvest, to try to find the spiritual information you were looking for was challenging. So there was this tradition called the Upanishads, where some of that spiritual knowledge was distilled into shorter, easily digested texts for people to understand a little bit better and read. Now, the word Upanishad means to sit near, and so most of these Upanishads appear as a dialogue between a student and a teacher, very similar to our very powerful text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is one you may have studied as a yoga student. So that's when we really see the term yoga coming around to describe these spiritual practices that are more mystical in nature than the religion of Hinduism. So there is a difference between religion and mysticism. mysticism is navigated on one's own without necessarily the intermediary or help of clergy or a codified or canonized type of system, whereas religion does generally have a clergy associated with it, as well as specific texts and canon that can be attributed to it. It's more of an external, I need help from the clergy to navigate the spiritual practices, as opposed to an internal, I'm going to try to go it on my own, which is mysticism. So that's a very simple and kind of nutshell difference between yoga and religion and mysticism. And yoga is a mystical practice. We, as yogis, have often rejected clergy members, and it was a bit of a reaction to some of the clergy that mysticism arises actually in many different traditions. In the Christian tradition, we have the mystical tradition of Gnosticism. In Islam, there is the mystical tradition of Sufism. In Judaism, there is the mystical tradition of Kabbalah. And in Hinduism, there is the mystical tradition of yoga. So this really happens everywhere, and it's very common. So we see yoga, the idea of uniting yourself with a greater source, something beyond you, in these texts called the Upanishads. Of course, we have Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which was written about 2,000 years ago, and then we have that really is the place where we see a further codification of yoga as a specific practice. Now, I also want to mention, we have all of these wonderful stories, let's say fables, folktales in our yoga tradition these days. The Yoga Sutra may not have been the most important text of its day. There may have been many other yogic texts and others that were even more popular. It's just that a copy of the Yoga Sutra happened to be found by a British scholar, I think in the 17th or 18th century, and was translated. And so that's the one that we know most well. We don't know that it was the most popular one in its time, but it is the one that has survived time in order to come to us and present yoga philosophy to us. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. So even still, we don't have asana. All right. Now, I'm sure that you've heard in the 8 limbs that asana is limb number 3, right? In the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali presents 8 limbs of yoga, and the 3rd limb is asana. But you'll notice in the entire rest of the Yoga Sutra, there aren't actually any specific asanas explained. And the word asana just means seat. And what he would have been indicating is your meditation seat. He would have been telling you that your literal meditation seat should be steady and comfortable. Sthira sukham asanam. He wasn't really indicating anything else. Yoga was a meditative practice. It has existed as a meditative practice throughout the millennia, and he would never have assumed that you would be doing sun salutations or warrior 3 or anything of the sort. That's what Patanjali was concerned about, was your meditation seat. So we still don't yet have any presence of physical postures as of 2,000 years ago. The first time that we actually do see physical yoga postures in texts, evidence of them, is around the 15th century in a text called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. That's the Americanized version of my pronunciation of it. More correctly, it would be the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And it was written around the 15th century. Again, we don't have an exact date, but we're thinking in the 1400s sometime. And we have 15 postures in there. 15. That's it. And there are no sun salutations. Most of the postures are seated postures. In fact, they're kinds of meditation postures. And the indication wasn't to do these postures all day, every day. The indication was simply to do these postures to stretch out the body enough in order to meditate and create more clear energetic pathways. The Yoga Pradipika talks a lot about the chakras and the nadis. So that was the emphasis. That was the slant. And this is actually also the first time that we see some elements of Ayurveda being mixed into yoga. So remember, we've got a lot of great folk tales hanging around about yoga these days. Yoga and Ayurveda, sure, they're sister sciences, but they're actually very different, and they have different goals. In Ayurveda, they want you to balance what are called your doshas, which are 3 types of who you are, Vata, Pitta, Kapha. more light, more dense, and more spicy, saucy, let's say. And all of us are a mix of these three types of being, and Ayurveda ultimately wants you to balance them. Well, yoga does not, okay? Those doshas arise out of something called the guna, which are the qualities of the universe. And these qualities also number in 3. And yoga says everything in the universe has these 3 qualities, yes, but we actually want to transcend all of those things. We don't want to balance them. We want to transcend them. These are very, very different aims. So yoga and Ayurveda don't actually go as well together as we have sort of forced them to go together today. Interesting to think about and interesting to consider as a part of yoga's history. So, moving on with our chat on asana. So, we've got some evidence that there are a few postures in around the 15th century, but no evidence that anyone is doing them fervently, and certainly no one was doing them in group classes. No one was sweating to them in hot rooms, and no one was organizing playlists to practice their yoga. It was merely to get into a better form of meditation and to cleanse your energetic body. Now, let's fast forward to when we really start to see asana come onto the scene. And what we need is context and understanding of what was happening around this time. So, of course, this would have been in India. This is the motherland of yoga, and we owe all of our thanks to yoga's roots, to this land, to these people, to this place. And in the early 19th century of India, you must understand that it was occupied by Britain. British forces were there, troops were there. Britain was trying to exert its rule over India. And I can only imagine that not only was that a very oppressive experience, but it was also a very disempowering experience for the native people of India. So we have this interesting climate at this time, and there happened to be a very well-known and very well-educated yogi by the name of T. Krishnamacharya. Now, T. Krishnamacharya is really the grandfather of our modern yoga practice, and he was quite a visionary. Now, as I describe him, he may do some things that you find curious or disagree with, but he did bring us to where we are today, and he had quite a visionary head on his shoulders. So he was trained by a guru, as yogis in that time were. And of course, he was a member of the priestly caste, as yogis of that time were. And you have to remember that prior to this time, prior to Krishnamacharya himself, the only people who practiced yoga were men of the priestly caste. Now, isn't that quite a big contrast to our statistics today, which says that about 80 to 85% of the practitioners of yoga are women, and of all classes, really. We don't have a caste system here in the West, so it would be difficult to figure out, who exactly in that idea, in that kind of stratus is practicing yoga, but it's primarily women. So that's a big shift in yoga's history. All right, so we've got this male tradition pulling us up to the early 20th century. We've got Krishnamacharya, who's a very well-educated, very smart yogi, and he is working for the Raj, the king of Mysore, which is a little city, very small, it's not big, in India, a couple hours from Bangalore, which is a much bigger city. Now, the Raj of Mysore, he had to give over a lot of his kingly duties and his palace even to the British, which must have been very uncomfortable. And in the morning, Krishnamacharya would see the British army warming up in the courtyard, and they would warm up with something called burpees. And Krishnamacharya thought that was interesting. And in his town, in the local area, there were a couple of British places. One was a gymnastics facility, and one was a wrestling facility. Both of these things were really popular for Brits, so they opened them. So gymnastics and wrestling. All right. Now, you've also got the British who have invaded India, and they have a very physical culture. The British are much stronger. They're just more physical in their ways of being. So they have, this interest in physical health and strength, in prowess, as it were. And that wasn't necessarily valued highly in India at that time. So Krishnamacharya was observing this. He was being in this state of occupation, and he was seeing that the Brits were warming up with their burpees in the courtyard. They were going to the gymnastics studio to learn how to be more flexible, and they were going to the wrestling gym to learn how to be more strong. And so he attended the wrestling gym. And one of the things that they do in the wrestling gym was they sit there cross-legged and they put their hands next to their hips and they press so that their feet and their legs lift up. If you've ever done Ashtanga yoga, you may have done that exact same move. And if you've ever studied gymnastics or seen Cirque du Soleil or watched the Olympics, you'll notice that there are a lot of things that occur in gymnastics that look just strangely like yoga asana. And if you've ever done a burpee, you'll know that it bears a striking resemblance to a sun salutation. Now, Krishnamacharya in India couldn't just make all this stuff up without pinning it on an historical tradition, right? So he's very carefully navigating both of these worlds, the British, who have this incredible physical strength that he wants to match, and he wants India to have its own culture of physical strength so that they can feel more empowered in their state. But he also is Indian himself, and he understands that the thing that India values perhaps most is tradition, is this lineage, is this legacy. So it would be very awkward for him to say, hey, I just created this. In America, we love that kind of thing. We love innovators. We love people doing new things, doing it their own way, doing things differently. But in that time and in that tradition, that's not necessarily a value. So here's the story that we have about the origination of Ashtanga yoga, which is what T. Krishnamacharya really brought us. He says that he went to some random library in India at the request of his teacher to find a text called the Yoga Kurunta. And when he found the only copy of this text, he looked at it just long enough to memorize the sequence before the text dissolved in his hands because it had been so eaten through by ants. And so there we have the birth of the original version of the Ashtanga yoga sequence, which is very different from the current version of the Ashtanga yoga sequence. Now, it's a challenging story, right? We don't have any way to verify it. You know, I love forensic science, and there's no way to forensically determine whether the Yoga Kurunta actually existed. But it's a great story, and what it does is it gives Krishnamacharya the history and the potency and the lineage he needed to essentially make asana relevant to his culture, and he's able to create this physical tradition as a part of yoga to boost the perception of the physical force of himself and his fellow practitioners in the eyes of the occupying British. I mean, honestly, it's kind of brilliant. So now suddenly Krishnamacharya has this beautiful physical tradition that he's able to bring to the Raj, who had charged him with doing something like this. And he starts to do yoga demonstrations for the British, to demonstrate for the British how strong his people, his country were. Very effective, very brilliant. And because he was doing this, people started to take notice. They really respected his work, and he started to gather very famous students. And in fact, it was Krishnamacharya who was the first yogi to take on a female student, Nishala Joy Devi. So we can thank her for our female tradition within yoga, which is also very modern. And he gained a couple of other very famous students that we will most likely know. One is Sri K. Pattabhi Jois. He wasn't the founder of the Ashtanga tradition, but he certainly really enforced it and further codified it and brought it into our world and made it very famous. And then Bks Iyengar, who was Krishnamacharya's, I believe his nephew, was also a student of his, but Iyengar was really sick. So Krishnamacharya did something different for Iyengar than he did for Pattabhi Jois. Pattabhi Jois showed up as this strapping teenage young man, and so he needed a much more rigorous practice to get all of his energy out, whereas Iyengar was much more sickly and he was struggling with some physical maladies. So Krishnamacharya did a very slow and more therapeutic form of the practice practice, which is why we have Iyengar yoga with all these props, and you may only do a few postures per practice or per class. So we've got a very different take because these individuals were treated individually by Krishnamacharya. Now, Pattabhi Jois, as the real proponent of Ashtanga yoga in our more modern age, he wrote a book called Yoga Mala, and he wrote it, I think, in the 1930s. And it was a book that outlined the practice of Ashtanga yoga, and that practice is very different than modern-day Ashtanga yoga. In fact, revolved triangle didn't even appear. Revolved side angle didn't even appear in Yoga Mala. That posture was introduced much later. And there were no vinyasa transitions between many of the poses. That also appeared much later, when he gained many more Western students who wanted the practice to last longer, who wanted it to be more physical. He started introducing these more physical elements and changing up the postures and adding new postures, literally making them up. And, I've been teaching yoga for over 20 years now. And in my 20 years, even I've seen postures that have evolved or arisen that were not even around when I first started. Broken triangle was not around. Reverse warrior was not around. There was a posture called falling star that was never around. Flip the dog was not a thing 20 years ago. We're literally still just making it up. So these things have a fairly recent history. And many of our yoga teachers have been innovating this yoga posture practice as we need it as modern Westerners. But we must understand and we must honor its roots. I think it's really important to know the history of yoga, to know the history of our beloved practice, to know where it came from, and it will give us a better sense of where it needs to develop and go in the future. And even as we continue to innovate into the future with this practice, I hope that we do our best to remain honorific of yoga's roots and remember what the purpose of yoga is, which is this psycho-spiritual state of centeredness and oneness and connection to a higher source. That was the purpose. That's why people started chanting 5,000 years ago. That's why people did ritual from 5,000 years ago until today. I've actually been to India many times, and there's one place that I've been to where there is a ritual that happens every single day at sunset, and it is said to have happened every single day for the last 5,000 years. And of course, when you go to Varanasi, the city of Shiva, there are the burning ghats where people bring their dead to be cremated. And it is said that the fires of those burning ghats have been burning every day for the last 5,000 years. There is something beautiful and strong in this legacy, this millennia-old tradition of India. And I believe as modern practitioners of the practice, it is our duty to honor those roots in the best way that we can, to be grateful that we have the ability to practice this, and to hold that torch of innovation as Krishnamacharya passed it to us, and to honor what it meant that he was desiring for yoga to be a strong and powerful gift to the world at large. So hopefully this has educated you a little bit about posture practice and where it's come from, and maybe enlightened you to what yoga is truly capable of, right? Yoga as a practice, as its long-standing practice, is designed as a psycho-spiritual practice, right? That's what Patanjali outlines in the Yoga Sutra. That's what we even see in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where we first see these 15 postures. They're trying to get you to a place where you are energetically clear enough to hold the state of enlightenment. That's the point. With asana being as recent as it is on the map of yoga, it is an unproven practice. We don't know that asana is actually capable of allowing us to reach the goal of yoga, which is this psycho-spiritual state of enlightenment. And, I have to say, that's not really the goal. That's just a major part of the practice. But yoga itself, that word, it means to unite your soul with something higher, your soul with the source. We don't know that asana allows us to do that. We don't know. We just don't have enough evidence. We don't have enough time with it. I don't know that we've been necessarily focused specifically on that, but I do know that yoga asana's goal is not necessarily a physical one. And so I know that as practitioners in the West, most of us, and I know that this was true for me, when we get into asana, there is this thought that we have to stretch further, that we have to hold longer, that we have to bend more. And that can actually lead to imbalance and injury, which is antithetical to yoga's aims. It can. I was a person who practiced asana almost every single day for 12 straight years, and that's before I got this memo that asana was brand new on the scene and kind of an unproven, new element of this practice. And that constant stretching and bending without other balancing activities like strength training or cardio can actually be very challenging on the physical body. We can become hypermobile. There are lots of evidence of injuries in yoga. There was an amazing New York Times article several years ago that talked about the injuries in yoga. It does happen. And I don't bring all this up to downplay or shame asana. I bring all this up so that we can be more intelligent about our application of it, so that we can be more realistic about how much emphasis we put on it, and so we can be more honest with ourselves about how much of it we really need to do, and what other parts of this powerful ancient practice might actually benefit us perhaps even more. So, give that a thought, and I'd love to hear what you think. The best way to connect with me is through my highereducation.yoga membership, and I invite you to join me for a 2-week trial for only $1, and you can find that at highereducation.yoga/trial. We'll be talking about asana and how we use it as teachers and spiritual leaders, so come join your fellow modern mystics and share your story with me. I'd love to hear more. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give me a rating on wherever you found this podcast, because it not only makes me feel amazing and I super appreciate it, but it also helps others to find this podcast as well. And of course, with the kind of work that we do, we definitely want to have more people doing it because we've got a lot of light to spread, my friends. Until the next podcast, namaste.